Otherwise, the new wine will burst the skins, and it will be spilled out, and the skins will be ruined. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins. And no one, after drinking old wine, wishes for new. For he says the old is good enough.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
The other ones are in Matthew 5 and also Mark chapter 2, but as I said, we won't turn over and read those. Let's see what questions I want to ask. I do these charts and then I forget what's on them. How many times in the Old Testament were the children of Israel required to fast?
Thank you. Yeah, I told you he could handle it. How many times?
June?
I didn't hear the whole question.
Oh.
I don't know.
Under the Old Covenant, the children of Israel, were they required to fast if they were required to fast? I think those are three correct questions. I know Ben knows the answer. Bobby?
No, there was the days of unleavened bread. All they could eat was unleavened bread.
Well, Day of Atonement. Day of Atonement, which today is what? Yom Kippur. Okay. And so they were seemingly, commentators disagree on that, but I kind of am persuaded that they were required to fast. The Pharisees in the first century, how many times did they fast per year, per month, per week? 2 times a week.
Yeah, the public in the center fast twice a week, he said.
Yeah, twice a week. And most believe, and again, I don't think the New Testament clarifies it, but most conclude that it was Monday and Thursday. And if you think about that, according to one writer, that was kind of, well, that's kind of smart, because the Sabbath, you skip Sunday, then Monday you fast, and then Tuesday and Wednesday you skip, and then Thursday you fast, and then you're back to the Sabbath. I don't know if that's a rationale or not, but they did fast 2 times a week, and it's believed to have been Monday and Thursday. Okay, when we enter into this, and we have John's disciples coming to Jesus, right? In this section that we're studying, John the Baptist, his disciples coming to Jesus. Where was John? Now, John was in prison. If you go all the way back, I think Matthew chapter 4 and verse number 12, John the Baptist is in prison. And so there are his disciples, and more than likely, I don't know how to put this, I'll try to put it delicately. They're followers of John the Baptist, but they probably are being persuaded somewhat by the Pharisees. Is that the correct way of putting it, an assumption on my part? Because apparently they're fasting like the Pharisees fast. And the Bible doesn't indicate anywhere that I'm aware of in the New Testament that John the Baptist taught to fast. Now, Jesus didn't necessarily teach to fast, but he taught to keep the old law, and so the conclusion would be necessary that by keeping the old law, he was saying, okay, you've got to do what the old law required. The Day of Atonement, you need to fast. But the Pharisees didn't quite keep the old law, did they? They had a few additions and maybe even subtractions to it. And that's kind of what we find. And so the question, when you read the verse, let's see, what verse was that? I'm almost afraid to go back. I tried doing that Sunday, that wouldn't advance for me, that's just me. Verse 33 of Luke chapter 5. I would encourage you to look at different translations. I did that for my benefit to help me understand something, and not necessarily that I prefer one over the other. If I said to you I prefer the New American Standard or the New King James, those two are my personal favorites, although I know they come from different manuscripts. The New American Standard coming from what we consider to be the oldest known manuscript. Sometimes you get, even if you look at the Amplified Bible, if you have access to Bible Gateway, sometimes go on BibleGateway.com and look at all the different translations. And the Amplified Bible, I call it basically nothing more than a commentary. Because that's what it amounts to, because there's so many additions of men But back in Luke chapter 5 and verse 33, and they said to him, the disciples of John often fast and offer prayers. The disciples of the Pharisees also do the same, but yours eat and drink. Well, at first when you look at that, at least the thought came to my mind was, are they saying that your disciples, talking about Jesus' disciples, don't fast? I don't think that's implied. That's why I say look at different translations. By the way that is worded, I think they're saying your disciples don't do like we do. Your disciples don't do like John the Baptist's disciples, and they don't do like the Pharisees. They're not fasting 2 times a week. And I think you'll probably come to that conclusion if you haven't already arrived at it yourself. That's still not working? Okay. So, is this microphone working now?
Okay, it is. Thank you. Takes 3 of us to get it going. I stand here, and the other 2 guys do the work. But where was I? Fasting. What's the purpose in fasting? Let's switch gears for just a moment before we actually get into the detail. We're not going to spend all that much time. I think eventually, if they're not already, I think the PowerPoint's being uploaded, so I gave you a bunch of excess material that you can look at sometime if you'd like to. You don't have to, but you can. But the question that I was thinking about asking in this particular instance concerning John the Baptist and his disciples and Jesus' disciples not fasting like the Pharisees and the others, what question do they raise with Jesus other than, why aren't your disciples fasting? What caused them to think about that in the text? What was the occasion? Maybe that's the better way of putting it. If I put the question correctly, then you can answer it. What was the occasion when they came to Jesus? What was going on?
Why are we not fasting like John's?
Well, no, but what were Jesus and his disciples doing? Where were they? They were probably still at Matthew's house, right? And Matthew had been called to be a disciple. And so Matthew calls together whom? His friends. And not only his friends, there's apparently a whole host of Jesus' disciples, and they're having a feast. And it's far removed from anything having to do with fasting. And so they're having a feast. And it seems to me as though they say, well, something's amiss here. We are accustomed to fasting. I don't know if this tells you what day of the week it was. I don't want to go there because I don't have any knowledge to share with you as to what day of the week it may have been. But they were apparently thinking or looking for Jesus' disciples to be involved in fasting. And here they are having a party. And really a banquet, I think. Some translations use the word banquet. And now we're going to get into, let's see if I gave you so much excess material, I may have messed myself up and trying to stay up with my slides tonight. Give me just a minute, if you will, please. Give you a lot of different information. Even going back to Zechariah. So let me just kind of twiddle my thumbs for a minute when see if I can get caught up. I should have done this before class, my apology. That would be a question that I would ask, are we required today to fast? That's an easy one to answer, no we're not. Prayer and fasting, it was practiced by New Testament Christians. I think you know that, and here are at least a couple of references to that. For some additional information, Paul and Barnabas going out to preach, Acts 13, verses 2 and 3. In Acts chapter 14, verse 23, before elders were appointed on this occasion, this is the occasion that we're told about, there was fasting that took place. So, getting back to our text, John's disciples, who may have been prompted by the Pharisees, were confused by Jesus' disciples' actions. The fact that Jesus' disciples were not fasting, but they were feasting and celebrating, okay, this is where I probably should have began. In the eyes of John's disciples may have indicated, I put disrespect in spiritual reverence or lack of spiritual reverence. That's probably what they were thinking, since you're not doing like we do. The traditions of the Pharisees became even more, you know this as well as I do, became more important than the old law. And so they would rather follow their traditions than they would the strictness of the old law. Mark agrees that the disciples of John and the Pharisees were fasting. However, they seemingly do not do so out of the spirit of the Israelite tradition. Here's extra for you in Matthew chapter 6, verses 16 through 18. Jesus' fasting instruction. And in just a moment, you're going to see a PowerPoint that goes kind of the very opposite of this. Jesus said, no gloomy faces. No, don't neglect your appearance. And they were doing both of these things in order to be seen by men. Not if that's their intention, of course. Matthew 6, verse 16, beginning there, Jesus' instruction for fasting. If you're going to fast, anoint your head, wash your face. Only your Father in heaven needs to know that you're fasting. Men don't need to take notice of it. So I wanted to at least share with you the contrast in doing that what the Pharisees did, they obviously did to be seen by men. Jesus said that's not the purpose of fasting. You don't need to be seen by others. When you do it, go ahead and anoint your head, take a bath, wash yourself, wash your face. You don't have to look all dirty and so on and so forth, because the only person that needs to know about is your Father in heaven. So a contrast. And we could probably talk about that for quite a bit. Now, with Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, here's what they do today. And I think I gathered all of the information on this. Only wear white clothing. That's what they do now. And of course, for girls, you have to be 12 years old. For boys, 13 years old. And then obviously you're an adult in the eyes of Jews today. So you fast, among other things. No cosmetics on the body whatsoever. No wearing of leather shoes. I haven't figured that one out yet. If someone knows the answer to that, I didn't want to take the time to research it. No sexual activity. So on Yom Kippur, this is what they basically stress when it comes to the Day of Atonement for their fasting. And once again, it's not according to what you find in the scriptures. And age 13 and over, it should be age 12 also for girls, age 13 for boys. On the eve, this is the one day per year that they ignore physical desires. And this is their statement. I copied their statement. I probably should have put a reference to it. They ignore physical desires in order to focus on the spiritual. And Ben, I think that's really a pretty good summation of fasting, don't you? Why a person legitimately, if they wanted to fast, why they would do it. You have a comment that you'd like to make on that? Any observation?
Pretty much covers a lot of it, but it's amazing if you go back to the original assignment or the original requirement, how much was added.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely right.
And
June?
that's what Jesus was really getting on them about, the man-made laws.
Well, in order to, they wanted to appear as though they were sullen and whatever other words that I can't think of.
Intentionally disfigure themselves.
Right.
Dirty clothes, didn't wash their hair.
Right. Yeah, dirt on their face and everything, and leave it there, and maybe even put it there. So others would look at you and think, okay, he's fasting, and he is so spiritual for doing this. And I'm not saying that a person is not spiritual if they do fast. But if you want a person to think you're spiritual, fasting, according to Jesus, isn't the way to go about it necessarily, the outward appearance. June, you had a comment? And then Jeff, did you have a comment? Okay, following June.
Esther, when she asked the women under her to fast for her for 3 nights before she went in to speak to the king, and it was for her. And God is not in that book, but yet this is something that she knew to do, being a Jew.
Yeah. And again, don't take any of my comments to suggest that fasting is a negative. I'm not inferring that whatsoever. I'm just trying to talk about the facts of it. If you fast 1 time a year, 2 times a year, or 1 time every 3, and you do that in order to humble yourself and maybe to draw your thoughts at least closer to God, God bless you. If you can accomplish that in doing that. Jeff, and then Bobby.
I was just going to say, fasting provides mental clarity, and unless you have experienced that firsthand, you don't really realize it. I have an anecdotal bit of evidence from when Justin and I were at Dave & Buster's. They didn't bring my food out, and my video gaming was at a level that it's never been at before, and I didn't eat anything that day. That's just one instance, but the mind works phenomenally well when it is not encumbered by the sluggishness of having to deal with the body digesting food.
You blew my whole class tonight. We're talking about spiritual things, and you say I fast so I can play better on the video games. What in the world is going on?
I'm just telling you, if you want to think clearly about things that are important, fasting is a way to help you do better.
Yeah, well, really, most of the books that you'll read about fasting has to do with the idea of meditating as well, so that you can push things out of your mind and draw a focus on whatever it is that you're attempting to focus on. So there's benefit in it. It's not as though I do it, but there's benefit in it. Bobby? Not for video games.
This isn't, to add to Jeff, what Jeff said, not the comment I was going to make, is recently was listening to a doctor talk about fasting, and he went through a lot of the details of what happens at 16 hours, 24 hours, 3 days. And it is amazing what happens in your brain, what happens in your body. You can actually, they've found with dementia and Alzheimer's patients that you can actually grow new brain cells after 36 hours and things like that. It's quite amazing what it does for your clarity and thinking. The comment I was going to make is that in the Old Testament, several times it seems to be it's linked with weeping and mourning and fasting. And if you haven't gone through this in your life, you might at some point, but sometimes you are so distraught and so sad about something, you don't want to eat anything. And you may feel like that for days, where everybody's trying to give you food, and you're saying, no, I don't want to eat. Because you're just not hungry. And so some of the times in the Old Testament it might have been, that's what it was. It was also linked to weeping and mourning and fasting in relation to their relationship with God. They had turned from Him, and He's telling them to do this, to turn back, and turn back to Him. Yeah. He expected that kind of mourning for their sin, and James even tells us we should mourn about our sin. So if we're mourning about our sin, fasting may go along with that. It's not, I'm just not going to eat. It's, I don't want to eat because I'm mourning.
And you probably had it in the correct sequence, as it happens many times, that you're troubled, difficulties are going on in your life, that you're weeping, and that leads into the fasting in order to restore. But no, there's obviously personal benefit from it. The bottom line is we're not commanded to do that in the New Testament. You can if you want to, but we're not commanded to do it. It's something, if you were to ask God, should I fast or shouldn't I fast, He would probably say, that's up to you, Ben. If you can gain something spiritually from it, do it. Yeah, okay, good. Jack?
Yeah, I wouldn't propose to know what God thinks if He's not revealed certain things on it. There's a lot of examples in the Old Testament where it was seen as significant to what they were doing, whether it's intercessory, praying for somebody or something, or for a certain outcome, or to bring themselves closer to God. I mean, I agree, there's nothing that says thou shalt fast.
Uh-huh.
But it's kind of like having a good tool in your toolbox, that you could use to help yourself. Or you're going to just say, nah, I don't want to use it.
Well, that's a good way of putting it, though, a good tool in the toolbox, because if you look at King David and the plight that he got himself into, well, there was probably lots, I say plural, but lots of mourning and fasting when it came to David in order to restore himself in the right thinking, to restore himself in a right relationship with God.
Right. There just seems to be, a lot of positivity to doing it. And it's, again, why not use a tool that can help you in your relationship with God?
Yeah.
Now, whether that's all because of you or for God, I don't know. But it just seems like a good tool to have at your disposal.
Yeah. Okay, any other observation? I appreciate everyone's observations except Jeff's. But no, he helps us with it, doesn't he? Now, seriously, any other observation about fasting? Oh, sure.
I think that when we look at David's reason for fasting, and when we look at what the text in Zechariah is saying about fasting,
In Zechariah 7, the passage I had up there? Okay.
that there is a major difference between the reason Pharisees sought to fast and the reasons given in the Old Testament why people sought to fast.
Yeah.
Let me illustrate it this way. Let us say that I studied for 3 or 4 hours. Would that make me more holy than if I had only studied for 1 hour? No. But the Pharisees seemed to feel that the more things they added to themselves, like for example, there were laws that were only given to the Levites and laws that were only given to the house of Aaron. The Pharisees started adding those to themselves, and it seems as if they were trying to become more and more holy by the more things that they did, instead of by humbly submitting to the will of God.
Now, and what's obvious about the Pharisees, and I don't know their heart, so you may be absolutely right that there were sincere Pharisees that were trying to get in touch with God and be closer to God and so on and so forth, but they seem to have this idea that we need to be seen by others as being holy and righteous, and they were. And a lot of these traditions is what led other people to look at the Pharisees and say, wow, they've got to be really holy individuals. But the bottom line is that they were substituting their traditions for what the old law taught. And when the Bible does give an indication of it, in order to be seen by men. And I think once again, if you go back to that Matthew chapter 6 text, when Jesus says, here's how you should fast, wash your face and put oil on your head, that's just counter to what the Pharisees were doing and what others were being influenced by them to do. So it's just counter. And so you're right, and the observation that Jack made is absolutely correct, and others that there is benefit in doing it. So I don't want to leave the impression that there's not benefit in doing it, but find the benefit in that it draws you closer to God. And it could be something other than fasting, but fasting is what we're talking about tonight. Okay, let's see. This may be, and I'm going to rely upon your knowledge as well, this may be the very first time that Jesus really directly alludes to his going away, to his death. But he says, sad days are coming. My disciples may be in a banquet now. We may be having a party. We may be having a feast. And, excuse me, my allergies. Things may be very joyous on this occasion. But the occasion calls for it, first of all. The occasion that Jesus was in right now with his disciples called for it, but the time is coming when the bridegroom, obviously a reference to himself, is going to be taken away. Then they will fast. And that kind of gets back maybe to Jack's point that maybe that's what his disciples would do, just because, and I don't think the New Testament gives us any indication that they did. But if you think of how forlorn, I guess is a word I don't use very often, and how distraught they were, and how troubled they were when Jesus died, maybe I suppose they did fast. I don't know. Jesus said that would, though, be the time that they would fast, and no one's going to have to tell them to do so. Not the Pharisees, not the John the Baptist's disciples. No one's going to have to tell them to do so. And again, getting back to maybe part of Jack's point, they're going to be drawn to do that because of the circumstances. The weeping and mourning even that Bobby talked about that seemed to come before fasting in many occasions in the Old Testament. And so they will at that time be sad, and that they will mourn the new, let's see. Okay, let's talk about Luke chapter 5 and verse 36. Enough about fasting. We've got to get to the context and talk about some of these things before our time runs out. I'll say Luke chapter 5 and verse 36. I'll get us back to it. And he was also telling them a parable. No one takes a piece from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. Otherwise, he will both tear the new, and the piece from the new will not match the old. Someone please explain that to me. When I was growing up, I had jeans and I had patches all over the knees. That's not related to my old jeans, is it? What's it related to? What is Jesus talking about? If you think a garment, and they didn't have jeans, and so it's a poor illustration, but if you take a garment that's wearing out, you generally try to take a patch of a new cloth from the loom, I think as the text would bear out, and even the Greek, and you try to cover it up so that you can prolong the use of the old garment. Is that a practical way of looking at it, of what we try and do? Okay, what did Jesus say was going to happen when you did that? He was trying to make a point, by the way. You know what the point he's trying to make, but what's he trying to illustrate? What's going to happen?
When it says up there, new will not match the old.
Okay.
I've worked with thousands and thousands of fabric, and if it's a different color, you can't make them be alike. You take an old piece and they want us to patch it, you can't do that.
And which fabric is going to be stronger? The new. And so when there's pulling or tugging on that, that's going to make, we'll call it the hole or the separation in the old garment. It's going to worsen it. It's not going to really accomplish what you wanted it to accomplish, okay? What is Jesus talking about by using this as a point of illustration?
Isn't he just making a simple distinction between himself and even John the Baptist and the Pharisees?
Yep.
They're all different than his ministry himself. So you're not going to easily come or easily marry yourself to him. Coming even from John the Baptist, you see that later, his disciples were still struggling with things from the Holy Spirit. And certainly if you're not a Pharisee, you're going to quickly come and accept the new wine.
Yeah. That's excellent. In studying with folks, and I'll think of how I should put this. I should have thought about it ahead of time, but I've studied with a lot of folks that wanted to hold on to some of the Old Testament and the ways and the practices of the Old Testament. And it's really kind of what the Judaizers tried to do in the first century, and then take part of the New Testament and join them together. What's the fallacy in that? Well, first of all, can that be done? I've heard people say before, and I don't think I'm stepping on anyone's toes, but I've heard people say before that, well, the new covenant is just the old covenant, and it's just kind of redone a little bit. No, I'll challenge you on that. That's not the case. It is not. Jeremiah chapter 31, that's also quoted in Hebrews chapter 8, tells us that it will be a new covenant, and that new covenant will not be according to the old. Now, someone may say, well, but there's this in the old covenant, and there's this in the new covenant as well. That's only because that's God and how He is and His character. But it's not as though God said to the angels or to Jesus or to the Holy Spirit, hey, we got this old covenant, we need to revise it some. That's not the case. Go ahead.
One thing, the old covenant and the new covenant are only similar in that they both deal with bad and good. And the standards for good and evil have not changed since either covenant were.
And why would that be? Because God has not changed.
Because God defines what is good.
Absolutely.
God hasn't changed.
Yeah. And so if it's a sin to lie under the old covenant, I wouldn't have to see the new covenant before I would be able to tell you that it's going to be a sin to lie under the new covenant, because that's God. God cannot lie. And so what were the Judaizers attempting to do? I brought the Judaizers up. Let me get back there to you. Okay. What were the Judaizers attempting to do?
I don't think that the subject here is the Old Covenant, because the disciples of John and the Pharisees were not actually discussing the idea that Jesus' disciples were following the covenant. I think the idea is that when we come to Jesus, we have to purge from our minds and our hearts our old way of thinking. And the fasting of the Pharisees was their old way of thinking. And so, both in the subject of our past religious beliefs and also in the subject of our past knowledge, secular knowledge, we have to realize that the revelation of God and the knowledge of man don't mesh. They're like oil and water. And the things that are wise according to the flesh are oftentimes foolish according to the Spirit, and vice versa. That which is wise according to the Spirit is foolish according to the flesh. And so they just don't mesh.
Yeah, I think you put it a good way. The only thing I would add to that is that what made the distinction come up was they were trying to cling to the old and the old ways, and Jesus would obviously, it would have to be new.
The fasting was not what the old law actually commanded. You already pointed that out earlier.
Right.
It was not that they were trying to say, you're not keeping the old law. They were not saying your disciples are not trying to keep the old law. They were saying you're not keeping the traditions of the Pharisees.
Okay, I can give you that. I can give you that. Yes. No, that's okay. Because really all four things lead to this discussion.
Going to do a whole study of Hebrews right now, but
Yeah.
this new covenant is a manifestation of everything that the old covenant was always pointing to.
Yeah.
And so they don't mix. And you can go through Hebrews. Jesus is the better. Jesus is the better. Jesus is the better. Jesus was the manifestation of all of this stuff, including fasting and all of that. And what's the whole point of Hebrews, right? These
Right.
Hebrew Christians are wanting to go back. And he's saying, why would you want to go back? Don't go back. But they, again, that Judaizing was happening, and they were getting tempted by that, and they wanted to go back to their old ways. You can't mix the old and the new. Jesus is the only way.
Right.
Hebrews spells that out.
That's right. Well, I mean, going to the other point as well, if I can bring it to today's terminology. If I'm going to follow Jesus today, then I must dismiss everything else and follow Jesus. And I think that point can be made, but I think that point in being made also has to include the old covenant that they were trying to cling to, that the Pharisees were.
And I'm not denying that.
I know that.
I'm talking about the context
Yeah.
of that.
Okay. Go ahead, Ben.
Colossians 2, I think about verse 14.
Uh-huh. Nailed to the cross. Yeah.
It's done away with.
Yeah.
He nailed it to his cross because no one could keep that law perfectly. No one.
And again, no one could follow Jesus unless they were willing to, you name it, whatever label you want to put on it. No one can follow Jesus unless they're willing to take whatever it is that's in their past and leave it behind, if that's what's necessary in order to follow Jesus.
Yeah, the Gentiles had to overcome that just as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a good point. Very good point. June?
And today, everyone has to put the
Today.
past in the past.
That's right.
The past.
Yeah, whether we're talking about fasting or whether we're talking about whatever it might be, with 4,456 religions in the world today. And the same thing I try to say, even with myself, that I don't think that I have arrived, that I know everything there is to know. Now, when I find something that I don't know and I'm convicted that it's according to the truth, I've got to go where that leads me, if that's in essence following the Lord.
And I don't want to bring up an off topic, but the thing is, we're all in that same place where you are, in the fact that grace is going to help us in the day we stand before Jesus. As long as we are trying our very best to do what His Word says, period.
And with the heart that we're willing to put the other things in the past so that we can move forward with Jesus.
Absolutely.
Ben, go ahead.
Galatians 3:24.
Okay.
The purpose of the law, it was our truth
Yeah.
that brought us to Christ. So it has a very big importance.
Okay, what about the wineskins? Let's talk about that for just a moment. I'm sure that people in the first century would have maybe comprehended this a little bit better than what we do, but an old wineskin is going to lose its elasticity. I think I said that correctly. It's going to stiffen, it's going to become brittle. You put new wine, and new wine is grape juice. You put grape juice in an old wineskin, and the fermentation begins to take place, and it creates the expansion within the wineskin, and the old wineskin tears apart. Now, a couple of things here. Now, I think this is a point of distinction. When that happens, not only do you lose the old wineskin, you lose the new wine. So everything is lost. And so drawing that into our discussion, if we attempt to follow old, whether it's old traditions or old ways, or it's the old law, when we attempt to do that, we're going to end up losing both.
Like in the other example, it's going to end up tearing, it's going to ruin the garment even more than it already was.
That's right.
It just won't work.
That's right. It'll tear the old garment even worse, and the wineskin is going to burst open, and we'll lose the new wine, the grape juice that was in there, and so it will be to no avail for us or for them or for us to attempt to do that.
I think there's another really beautiful analogy with this idea of old and new wineskins. If we think about it in the context of baptism, our old bodies must be put away and be put to death in baptism, and we're raised up as new wineskins, able to be filled with the new wine, or the word of Jesus. And we can go and share that new wine that we have the capacity to store with other people and turn them into new wines.
Well, every other television program today is about renovation, isn't it, Jason? You renovate an old house. What's the hardest thing to do? Is it to, well, I'm going to leave the question at that. What's the hardest thing to do when it comes to renovation? To tear out the old
I mean, it's
and to get it ready.
It's much better most of the time to demo the house and start new.
I watch some of these shows and I think the very same thing. Bulldoze the thing down and build it, but that would run the show. But that's the hardest thing for us as well. But in order, again, to follow Jesus, we can't go home and bury our father. Let me first do that. We talked about that last week. We can't go home and say goodbye to our family or anything like that. It's a call that demands immediate attention. And in order to give it immediate attention, we've got to be willing to leave the old behind, whatever that is. Jeff, you had another video game comment.
No, I'm going to Matthew 23. There's no need.
Okay.
If you look at Jesus' condemnation of the Pharisees in Matthew 23, he starts off with some of the same statements that he's making about the Pharisees here. Don't do as they say, don't do as they do as they tell you. You're following hypocrites.
Yeah.
The pictures that he paints here with the old the garments and the wine, those are pictures of destruction. You cause more problems trying to mix this old thinking with what I'm teaching you than if you just put aside that old thinking and accepted what I was teaching you freshly. That's exactly what he's telling the hypocrites. He said, these are blind guides, and you're both going to fall into a ditch. They're going to travel across the seas and make a proselyte and then make him twice a child of hell as they are themselves. Jesus was saying following the teachings of the Pharisees is destruction, and that's the picture that he's painting.
Yeah. And again, when I bring in Judaizers, I know that's a few years down the road and things like that, but imagine yourself in the first century and you're a Gentile. And you found the Lord and you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and you're willing to commit your life to Him. And along come these Jews, Judaizers, who also are Christians, by the way, but they're saying to you and making demands of you, yes, you can become a follower of Jesus and you can be one of His faithful followers, but you have to do this and you have to do that. Imagine the confusion of that. That's why the comment, and I think June was the first to make it, we have to be willing to leave everything behind, whether it's the old law, traditions, the ways of the Pharisees, or whatever. If we don't, we're going to confuse the matter, and we're going to end up losing both the new wine and the wineskin alike. Jack?
Yeah, I know we're not saying as well, not to leave everything, because in the old law, we learn about God's holiness, for example.
Oh, yeah.
There's so much we
absolutely.
can learn from the old. So I don't want to make that misconception that it's all.
Yeah, we don't follow the old law of Moses, which contains all of the.
Old Testament,
Yeah.
just keep New Testaments and Psalms inside our pew books.
Yeah, the 616 commandments of the Old Testament need to be left behind. If there are duplications, fine. But the duplications are only because they're in the New Testament. That's the way of God. Okay. Let's see, where are we? We're down to verse number 38 in my mind. The new wine must be put into fresh wineskins. And then verse 39, and no one after drinking old wine wishes for new, for it says, the old is good enough. Isn't that what we've been talking about, Bobby? It's an interesting way of putting it, I'll give you that. But isn't that the way, what we've been talking about? Yes, go ahead.
I was just going to ask a question.
Oh, Jeff's going to answer all the questions.
Didn't Paul warn against us worrying and doing with traditions?
Oh, yeah.
Let them go.
And Jesus as well, absolutely. But again, what's under consideration here is that, kind of like what we've talked about, that if you attempt to hold on to, again, we'll call it the traditions of men, the ways of the Pharisees, or the old covenant, all of those things combined, if you attempt to do that, someone might say, kind of like the Pharisees and others, this is good enough. We'll just stick with what we have. Why should we make any changes? Yes, go ahead.
I think if we stand back and look at like 10,000 feet or whatever you're saying, it's easy for us now down the road to look back and say, hey, these Pharisees were wrong. They should have just moved on and leave everything. Do you drive a Tesla? Do you use all the latest technology out there? Probably not. I'm struggling with the technology. We're humans. We struggle with change.
Yeah, we do.
And so you can imagine having followed this for years and years and years, centuries and centuries, some wise guy popping up and saying, hey, let's change everything over and follow me.
Yeah.
That's really,
Well,
really difficult.
not only is it hard for the Pharisees, yeah, we're surrounded by that today. Let me make this observation before we close. It still comes back to what we think about Jesus, and are we willing to put everything that needs to be put, I'll rephrase it that way, behind us, or if we don't, that's going to impede our progress. And it's going to stop us from being the followers that we need to be.